U.S. culture in the 1920s. And look what I did here. Look at this title, Flicks, Flappers, and Fear. You have to have a catchy title for 1920 stuff. When we talk about U.S. culture in the 1920s, that's a big topic. But I think the way to sort of enter it is to talk about the thing that most of us know about in relation to the 1920s, which is the advent of movies. Before 1920, most films were very rough. There were no, even in the 1920s and most of the 1920s, there was no such thing as a talking picture. Most of them were silent. But by one thing that's pretty important to understand in terms of in relation to US history and movies is that by the 1920s, the United States was the world leader in cinema, was the world leader in film. And one thing you should also understand is that the US still is. One of the reasons why the US film industry, for instance, centers in California in the 1920s is because of the needs of film, is because of light, because of natural sunlight. Thomas Edison had a movie studio in Edison, New Jersey, but it was really difficult to get the correct light all the time because of the often cloudy skies in the Northeast. And so the film industry really started to take off in California in the 1920s and became really a world leader and starts to ship this cultural commodity of movies and film and stars all around the world. And one thing that's important to understand about the United States, we can talk all we want in the 20th century about the power of the United States in relation to the U.S. Military and U.S. foreign power overseas and gross domestic product and things like that. But the power of U.S. culture in being a force around the world that shapes the way the rest of the world looks at the United States, we can see that phenomena being born here in the 1920s in film. People like Charlie Chaplin, who becomes a mega star. His very funny kind of slapstick comedies were also, because they were silent, they were pretty much endlessly exportable. Everybody could kind of be entertained by them, even if you didn't speak English, because they just put in different title cards to say what was going on. By 1919, the US makes 90% of the world's movies and really creates the idea of the star, the movie star. Now you had, of course, in theater, you had stars and you had people in theater who were famous, but remember, how many people can a theater performer really reach? In a movie, you have the endless reproducibility of the format, and so everybody can kind of see Charlie Chaplin simultaneously in like 70 different cities, which is something that Charlie Chaplin couldn't do if he was a theater actor. Talkies begin in the 1920s. First one being Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. And these were the first films that actually had a speaking track, which was kind of married to the film track. And so you could have both sound and this really changed cinema forever, because many of those silent film stars then actually couldn't find work when people heard their voice. So, and this was a lot of the attraction of Southern California, was, again, a lot of that light and this sort of, so when we talk about Hollywood today, Hollywood really comes from this 1920s context. Some other things that affect American culture to a great extent in the 1920s are the automobile. And it affects it not just in terms of the invention of the automobile, and there's a lot to be said about all the different companies and the competition, but really about how the auto changes American culture. First of all, cars are mass produced. So in the early years of the automobile, you had to be very, very wealthy to own an automobile. They were manufactured quite slowly, and it would be very hard for sort of anybody in the middle class, or certainly anybody below a certain income level, to own one. Well, one thing that starts to happen, and we'll see this with the Model T, and we saw this with the Model T, was the sort of proliferation of cars, of affordable cars. Now, everybody with the Model T and for other cars that came after it that were affordable and built in the same kind of assembly line mass production way, everybody starts to own a car. And then once everybody starts to own a car, and once you have various communities, not only cities, but also towns and villages that start to have cars coming through, they start to, that brings the march for roads, brings the march for large scale highways, and brings the call for more taxes. So remember today, a lot of your taxes go towards roads, and that's because of cars. So improving roads was necessary to hold people's investment in the cars that they were purchasing so that the car wouldn't fall apart when it hit a pothole. It also created suburbs. You start to create cities start to change. Los Angeles, for instance, is a completely car-driven city in that Los Angeles would not survive without the car. And suburbs, those places where people live and then commute in and out of the city each day with their car, that really begins in the 1920s and 1930s. Before that, most people lived in the city and worked in the city, and that starts to change irrevocably, really beginning in the 20s and 30s. And you have these cities start to sprawl outward, like Los Angeles, and also many other Western cities are the same way. Culturally, we should understand that cars also introduced an aspect to the United States and for Americans that starts to represent freedom. Now, all those older ideas of freedom that were connected to politics or connected to labor or connected to that concept of freedom starts to be connected to car ownership. Remember, and this is true of a car, if you own a car or if you, that all you have to do is put basically $50 worth of gasoline into your car, and you could go 300 miles in any direction. Imagine what the world would have been like for somebody who suddenly had that possibility and then never had that possibility before. Before your geographic zone, you're limited to basically 20 miles where you can get in a horse and buggy or where you can get perhaps via train, but train, you don't own the train. This is a invention which gives people the power to really be more free and independent, many people feel anyway, more free and independent than they would have before. The speed of the car, the power of being able to take that car wherever you want, the power that you have to escape your current situation with a car. All of these are things that people before the car did not really have in as readily available of an invention. Another thing about cars is that we all know the stereotype of cars being sort of a place where young lovers are able to be alone. We've all heard of that concept before. Well, before cars come around, usually, I guess if you think stereotypically, courting, meaning like two people trying to get together for the purposes of marriage or dating or et cetera, they're kind of surveilled. That somebody would come over to somebody else's porch, somebody would have a glass of lemonade, they'd be watched by the parents. The car eliminates that, right? The car means, hey, mom, dad, see you later. I'm going to the movies, with my date. And so cars also become a point where the generations start to split in the 1920s. You have an older generation that has not grown up like this, has not grown up with this freedom, mobility, has not grown up with electricity, all of these new inventions. And you have this new group of teenagers and 20-year-olds who suddenly have this invention that allows them freedom that, again, their parents never could have dreamed of. So not only do you have this sort of culture erupting, which is much more liberating for many youth, you also have a lot more outlets for people to use their leisure time. As the economy sort of really starts to take off in the 1920s in the United States, you start to have more places where people can spend that money. So people have more money to kind of spend on leisure activities, and people are working less hours. and making more money. And so they spend it on movies, right? They spend it on cars. They spend it on appliances like toasters and vacuum cleaners and all those sort of things. But also they spend it on professional sports. You have arising in the 1920s the beginning of professional sports leagues. When you think about baseball, for instance, and you think about the New York Yankees, and you think about the 1920s New York Yankees, well, that's really a phenomena of the 1920s. These large-scale sports teams in which you have tens of thousands of people coming from all over to watch that one sports team, that really starts to take off in the 1920s. It takes off to a certain extent in the 19 teens, but definitely in the 1920s. It also takes off because of things like radios, because now you can hear your sports team. And so it extends the range and the marketability of that particular sports team and mass culture in general. You also have the advent of phonographs, music, jazz, music that people before would not have had access to or would never have been able to listen to before. You start to have the reproducibility of music becomes the norm, and the kind of power of singers and stars to extend their reach through the reproducible format of the phonograph record really shouldn't be underestimated. That and radio starts to create a totally different type of culture. Radios also, we should understand, and this is something that we'll discuss more during the Great Depression, but radios are also instrumental in politics. That a politician is going to be able to extend the reach of their ideas much further with the advent of radio than they were before. Before, one would have to read the newspaper or go to a speech or something along those lines. Now, somebody can immediately have their speech and reach a wide audience. This has a lot to do, without radio, it's hard to imagine how Adolf Hitler would have had the kind of cultural power in Germany that he did, because he reached into all of these German homes. Roosevelt, on the other hand, also used the radio in the 1930s with his fireside chats. So you see, these are just two examples of politicians who are able to really become larger than life politicians through the ability for them to have their voice and ideas heard almost globally in some cases. Well, no, all of this liberation and all of this new culture that is arising in the 1920s is not going to happen without resistance. Remember, for instance, that those parents who before would surveil their children on the porch as they got to know, the other men and women in the village, other boys and girls in the village, that power is lost, right? And that's just one example. Now their children are getting in a car and saying later and dressing in all sorts of fashions that they never could have imagined. And so you start to have, among a large sector of the American public, a kind of backlash against this change in culture in the 1920s. This technological change was alienating for many Americans. Radio, remember, also, which really starts out as an urban phenomenon, because that's where you can have the towers, starts to proliferate not only into the suburbs, but also into rural locations. Now you could have a radio program playing jazz, right, which is primarily African-American music in a small, white town in the middle of Indiana, for instance. So this is changing the culture. This is something which, while you might have had cultural change in urban context before, the ability for people of different cultures to reach into these very far-flung rural areas, it was unparalleled. It would never occurred to this extent except in the 1920s. So this was a time of great change and a great encounter with other cultures that some were having quite enthusiastically, but then again, some were turning against this. And you start to see this cultural divide that starts to open up in the 1920s. And I'm hesitant to say that cultural divide is still with us today, but you can see a lot of similarities in how the cultural divide that we have in the United States today, and you to a certain extent have globally in various contexts, with the advent of these new kind of pervasive technologies, you can see similarities. Films, which before film, it was very hard. It was very difficult to see flesh, right? Photography was something which was rather discreet. And now with film, you can see things like Clara Bow's ankles, which I think you can kind of see them here, her bare shoulders. This was considered scandalous in many communities. Clara Bow, for instance, was called the it girl. She was really epitomized this liberal flapper of the 1920s. Her fashion, her way of acting, her kind of flirtatious manner on the screen was always something which kind of, she became kind of a symbol of this new world of the 1920s. But it was also a new world which many who believed that bare shoulders and ankles were scandalous would have found disturbing in that case. And so radio and film are also introducing many of these far-flung rural locations to the other, meaning they're introducing them to people who either African Americans or people who are Jewish or people of just different backgrounds and ethnicities that people in many of these communities would not have been exposed to before and would have considered the other, considered them as different, as not them. Well, now many people are relating to people from all over the world because of radio and film. It's really bringing a lot of the world together, but again, it's causing a backlash on others who feel something sinister is happening with all of this change. And you have in the 1920s, attendant with this flowering of art through film and radio and recorded music and mass culture, you have a real backlash against immigrants in the 1920s. We call this the nativist, I call this the nativist reaction. In 1924, Congress passes the National Origins Act. And I'm not saying that this backlash against immigrants was totally occasioned by film and things like that. There were a lot of other cultural reasons post-World War I that had to do with this, such as the fear of communism and this general conservatism of the American presidency during this time. But in 1924, this particular National Origins Act actually severely restricts immigration. Prior to this, immigration was largely not unchecked, but it was a process in which immigrants would come over and then be processed. And the idea was that the United States was accepting people from other shores. This would be a boon for the American economy to have all of this labor. In any case, the National Origins Act greatly sort of cuts off the spigot of that massive migration that you had between, say, 1880 and 1910 and World War I. Only 150,000 immigrants would be allowed in per year. In some cases, millions of immigrants would come. To the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, I believe. And this had gone on because of fear of competition from Asian labor generally, but it also came through just via racism. Japanese were completely blocked in this National Origins Act, and this really was a really sore point among the Japanese. Remember, Japan at this time was becoming very powerful industrially. Japan had defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War about a decade earlier, and the Japanese believed that not only were they they considered themselves completely developed country, and that they shouldn't be treated with such disdain or treated with such racism. And so this really actually did not do any good things for U.S.-Japanese relations. And as you see, what happened 17 years later is Pearl Harbor. And this really is the end of this chapter of this immigration ideal, which had brought so many Eastern Europeans, so many Jews, Italians, people from Poland, people from many Slavic nations, and people from elsewhere around the world as well, brought them into the United States. And this really cut off that flow. It really cut off that for several years. It really wouldn't be until the 1960s where you had a new series of immigration laws, which greatly loosened up these quotas, that you started to see new rounds of immigrants coming into the United States. And of course, a lot of this National Origins Act was motivated not only by racism, but also by the pseudoscience of eugenics at the time, which had these pseudoscientific theories regarding not only races, but also proper breeding and things like that. And a lot of this fed into the ways that the 1920s American public started to see immigrants and look at immigrants. This in another note, we have the rising of another form of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, if you remember from talks on Reconstruction, that the Ku Klux Klan starts out really as a terrorist army in the South of largely ex-Confederates or Confederate sympathizers who basically start to create a terrorist police state in terrorizing African Americans into not voting and not exercising their civil rights. And the Ku Klux Klan is a really powerful terrorist arm of the sort of white, basically all white governments in the South after, during Jim Crow and after Reconstruction. Well, the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s is different. The Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s is not a Southern Klan that's focused on African Americans in the South in that context. This is a Ku Klux Klan, which is a national movement. And it is a movement, it's a national political movement, it's active in politics all over the country. It's active in the West, it's active in the Midwest to a great extent. This is Richmond, Virginia in 1920. These are a line of Model Ts. You can see this, all the cars are Model Ts and everybody's in white hoods in this march. And the targets for this Ku Klux Klan were not only African Americans, but they really spread their kind of fear and nativism towards Jews, immigrants, Catholics, homosexuals, really anybody who was not a white Protestant or anybody who would not kind of trace their lineage back to the white Protestants who came over prior to the Civil War. And a lot of this is a reaction to this immigration that comes in the 1880s and between 1880 and 1910. And it's also a reaction against any sort of efforts by African Americans in the North or South to exercise their rights. You see, so it's almost like the Ku Klux Klan becomes like a viral phenomena in the 1920s among white Protestants who living all over the country take this Southern racist terrorist institution and then really nationalize it to a certain extent. And the Ku Klux Klan would be a force. Now, people aren't getting elected who are necessarily who are necessarily running on a Ku Klux Klan ticket. But if you have in the South many Southern Democrats who are politicians, many of them who go to Congress, they are members of the Ku Klux Klan. And again, it's a different Klan. It's in many ways worse. It's a national Klan, and its targets are much more diverse too. To end this part about culture in the 1920s, we have to go to the trial of the 1920s, one of the trials of the century, which is the Scopes trial. And the Scopes trial brought out all of these kind of cross currents in American society that were going on. These fears of change, fears of cultural change, fears of scientific change against sort of traditional beliefs. And it's probably a stretch to say everything's wrapped up in the Scopes trial, but the Scopes trial became one of those things that people in the 1920s were fascinated about. They listened to the trial on the radio, and it really showed this kind of cultural divide in the way that people reacted to the trial. It started with the Tennessee legislature ends up banning the teaching of evolution and ends up passing a law that says, look, you can't teach Darwin's theory of evolution that because this was against really what the Bible said, right? Or what the Holy Bible said, that the world was created in 7 days. So you have this very sort of religiously motivated legislature which passes this law to stop the teaching of evolution. Well, unfortunately for Tennessee, is that the state had a mandated textbook which taught evolution. So there was a biology teacher by the name of John T. Scopes who basically went to the American Civil Liberties Union and said, look, this is ridiculous. How am I supposed to teach biology if I'm told that I can't teach evolution? It's biology. So, and it's in the textbook I'm supposed to use. So he basically volunteered to kind of get himself cited for this, or get himself, and then they challenged the law. And this trial, which took place in Tennessee, had cameras from all over the place and radio, et cetera. For the defense, you had the most famous defense attorney of the day. This became kind of like a carnival in terms of the personalities involved. Clarence Darrow was the most famous defense attorney of the day, so he decided he's defending Scopes. And then for the prosecution, you have William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan had actually run for president 4 times. He'd lost all the times that he'd run, but he was a pretty powerful and well-known Democratic politician in the 1890s and 19 teens. He'd gotten quite old by 1924, but he volunteered to be basically the prosecutor who would prosecute this case against Scopes, again, because he taught evolution. And the outcome of this was in the end, it was less important than the fact that you had this really fervent discussion in American society about where American society was going. And it all comes down to Darwin, right? And it all comes down to this one, sort of decision as to whether to teach evolution or not. But really at the heart of the Scopes trial is an idea that there's 2 Americas. There's a modernist America who is accepting science, who is embracing many of these new changes and many of these new beliefs. But then there's also another America. There's another America that's incredibly resistant to this, that feels this is an affront against their traditional beliefs. It's an affront against them. And in some ways, that America maintains its resistant kind of identity to the cultural changes that are coming out of the 1920s through mass culture and technology. And you do find today, and I don't mean to extrapolate this too far, but you do find that in some of if you trace back the history of these, what we call the cultural divide in the country today, between those who kind of embrace change and embrace these changes in technology and those who resist it, you do find that you can trace a lot of these fears and a lot of this split back to the 1920s. After World War II, you have a rise in evangelicals, a sort of rise in evangelical churches. They start to boom after World War II. And it's quite possible that this is all a process of a post-1920s split in American society. Now, remember, this is not only going on in the United States. These challenges to traditional, quote unquote, beliefs and religious beliefs and practices, et cetera, they're happening really all over the world. I mean, the television and movies and film and radio and these things, they're challenging cultures all over the world. But in the United States context, I think the Scopes trial, eventually Scopes is actually found guilty of this, but then it's overturned on a technicality or something along those lines. So again, the outcome's not important. But the Scopes trial itself becomes this circus that many in the New York press and many of those who consider themselves modernists relentlessly mock those who believe in Bryan's prosecution. Bryan comes out looking, if you are a modernist, Bryan comes out looking like a fool. But again, if you're on the other side, you might think he's nobly standing up to this march march of change that many of these cultures, many of these societies inside the United States are resistant to.